From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ambassador David Satterfield. Baker Briefing tackles the most critical foreign and domestic policy issues of the day. Each episode is recorded in front of a live audience at Rice University in Houston.
The topic of today's Baker Briefing is the Turkish elections. On May 14th, a very short time from now, what has been described, I think correctly, as the most consequential elections in Turkey since 1950 will be held. Polling, however reliable or unreliable, at least is consistent in terms of trends and outcomes. And it shows the opposition alliance, led by Kemal Kilicdaroglu, as very close to a 50% majority, which would secure +1 a first-round victory. If that is not, in fact, the case, in 2 weeks' time, on the 28th of May, a second round will be held that will feature only 2 candidates. But there have been dramatic events in the few hours before the recording of this briefing. One breakaway former opposition candidate against Erdogan in 2018, Muharrem İnce, has withdrawn from the race. And there is much speculation as to whether this will in fact give the necessary majority to the opposition coalition. We're going to be talking today with 2 noted observers and commentators on Turkish politics, Turkey's international relations, Turkey and its future. Aslı Aydıntaşbaş, a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute, and Soner Cagaptay, fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Aslı, Soner, welcome. I'm going to ask both of you. Aslı first, what do you think the polls will reveal come the evening of the 14th or the morning of the 15th? Will there be a first-round majority for either President Erdogan and his partner, the nationalist MHP, or for the opposition table of 6?
Hi, David. Good to be here. I'm torn between intuition and analysis. Analysis is that I think it will be tight and that the opposition candidate, Kemal Kilicdaroglu, would not win in the first round, and this would go to a runoff. The intuition is that, in part because I'm now in Turkey, just came here from Washington, D.C., and people seem enormously galvanized. And there's no doubt in my mind that the majority of this country wants some change. Erdogan, in fact, is facing an anti-Erdogan majority. The question is whether they think of Kemal Kilicdaroglu as a change agent, as the person to give the mandate to. That's the question. Otherwise, I have no question in my mind that in some way, metaphorically, this is Erdogan's last stand. The question is it this election or the next one? So the likelihood of a runoff is there. Both sides seem extremely galvanized. And more importantly, for the past few days, watching the campaigns and listening to every speech, in fact, too much, they are offering 2 different visions entirely, apples and oranges. President Erdogan is talking about rising Turkey, a Turkey that will be a global power, homegrown defense industry, Turkey's first aircraft carrier, first helicopter, first tank, etc. And he is saying Turkey is surrounded by enemies and their internal enemies backed by the West as well. The opposition, he accuses them of being backed by the West, and that he's the guy to steer the country to a safe harbor in this tumultuous, dangerous time. It's very negative, the campaign, and he does call, in fact, the opposition either affiliated with terrorists or terrorists themselves. On occasions, that has slipped. Meanwhile, the opposition, led by Kemal Kilicdaroglu, coming from a minority background, not necessarily the most charismatic figure in Turkish politics, a former civil servant, his proposition is twofold. First, democracy, that, diversity and plurality, we need to bring this country back to rule of law in a diverse setting. Essentially, the key proposition is a return to democracy. But there's a second part to it, because Turkish economy is in such a fragile state with hyperinflation that affects everybody's lives. I think he has made somewhat of a compelling case that in order for the lives of citizens to improve, the governance system in the country has to transition to rule of law, democracy, do away with what opposition calls one-man regime. So I think that case they have made in a compelling manner, that for a better economy, Turkey needs a better democracy, in fact, a democracy and rule of law.
Soder?
Thank you, David, for hosting me. It's great to be on the same panel with you and Aslı. So I think on paper, Erdogan should be losing, right? Economy is in troubles, nearly triple-digit inflation last year at 50% now, still higher than it has been for more than 20 years. United opposition, a big part of it. Erdogan was blessed until recently by an opposition that was constituted by disparate groups, to the extent that the gap between opposition groups was wider than the gap between them and Erdogan. But a switch in 2018 to a presidential system was a cardinal error for him, I believe. Yes, it made him more powerful, a head of state, head of government, head of ruling party, head of the police and national force, head of the military as commander-in-chief. He became Turkey's new sultan. But simultaneously, at the top of his power, he also saw a unified opposition under the previous system. Opposition parties ran in a multi-party parliamentary democratic race. Now it's a presidential system. It requires a two-way race. Someone needs to get 50%. Opposition parties realize that if they're not united, they'll never defeat him. So they came together, and I think that's completely Erdogan's doing. As is the sad state of the economy, his kind of embrace of unorthodox policies. He believes that interest rates drive inflation and not the other way around. That has really brought the economy down. So on paper, he should be losing. Then you have his post-earthquake performance. Erdogan, as authoritarian populists typically do, has gutted out Turkey's institutions. Relief agencies were nowhere after the earthquake when thousands, sadly, died under the rubble waiting for help to come. That should have buried any leader, but I think what is Erdogan's strength is that his complete control of information flow. He controls 90% of the media. 80% of Turkey's citizens cannot read languages other than Turkish. So he curates reality for them. And the reality in Turkey the last few months has not been the crisis, lack of democracy, journalists and opposition leaders harassed, physically targeted, or where was the government relief effort after the earthquake? But the story and the narrative has been just something completely different. Turkey is a rising military industrial power. If you follow Turkey from outside, you could say, well, that's part of the story, but there's a lot more going on. But in Turkey, you're led to believe that is it. So I think Erdogan is lean onto his control of the media and in the institutions, many of the courts, electoral bodies, to narrow the gap. What would have been perhaps a near double-digit gap between him and Kilicdaroglu, down to what I call a statistical dead heat. So maybe this will be within a few points margin. Maybe the two leaders will be very, very close to each other. Erdogan is an astute politician. Whether or not you like him, he's probably one of the best politicians around in the sense that he knows how to win elections and divide his opposition. So he realized in this game, it's not realistic for him to reach for victory in the first round. He wants to deny Kilicdaroglu, opposition leader, a victory in the first round. Enter one more element of Erdogan's power game. That is the third poll candidate, İnce. He just dropped out of the race, but I think he served his purpose. İnce entered the race because Erdogan realized that if the race is two-way, he will lose in the first round, notwithstanding his control of institutions and information narrative. İnce came from nowhere after the earthquake. Surprising timing. Just as criticism of the president was building up, İnce ran a populist campaign, appealed to mostly young voters who were disgruntled and disappointed with the political elites, regardless of whether they're on the right or on the left. And İnce's simple social media presence, in my view, far outweighed the financial means available to his party. So was he funded by pro-Erdogan businesses or others? Probably. Did this help his campaign? Yes. But then, of course, the electorate ultimately consolidated around two candidates. And I think İnce, having seen his popularity drop 1% to 2%, dropped out of the race. I don't think that's a selfless act. I think he realized that he will be humiliated in the polls, but he was able to deny Kilicdaroglu the political momentum as the front-runner candidate after the election. And that shows you, I think, how a masterful politician Erdogan is. We're now setting the stage, I guess, for at least a runoff. And I think in most countries, elections last a day. In Turkey, the election day will be from May 14th, Sunday through May 28th. It will be 14 days squeezed into one. So welcome to political fun, everyone.
For both of you, outside observers unfamiliar with Turkey might say this is an autocratic system, if not beyond that. If Erdogan has the powers that he does, if this election cannot be fair in terms of the playing field, will the outcome first be a genuine reflection of the will of the Turkish people, notwithstanding the unfairness of the setting? And secondly, if Erdogan should ultimately be defeated, will he leave office or will he cling to power? Both of you, please.
Well, David, one thing that I noticed is there's a huge gap between how people interpret what's happening in Turkey at home here in Turkey versus how they see it externally. The assumption abroad is that Turkey is long past the Rubicon. This is a country that has long gone in the other direction, diverged from a democratic path, and therefore Erdogan is a lifetime leader. I think here people feel political struggle does have a chance and that elections take place in an uneven playing field, no doubt, increasingly illiberal, if not autocratic, but that on the day of election, it's free and fair. It is a dilemma because Turkey is evidently quite illiberal in terms of media control. Soner has talked about some of the communications issues. Of course, President Erdogan has eliminated perhaps his most formidable rival, the mayor of Istanbul, and not to mention quite a few Kurdish politicians and elected mayors in jail. But nonetheless, because the country has had multi-party elections for so long, and because the country has had elections for so long, unlike many countries in its region, there is a competitive monitoring system that's in place, which means that on the day of voting, people go vote, and there are observers from 7 political parties. And in some places in the countryside, they're not that organized, opposition parties. But in big cities, which is where the majority of population lives, they have observers. Now, the fact that it's been relatively transparent on the day of voting, despite an autocratic period in the run-up to election, make Turkey this strange, different, weird bird in a sense, because it's really not Russia and China. I think that I see a lot of optimism on the part of opposition. It's more whether or not the candidate is compelling enough for voters rather than the sort of irregularities and fraud that will determine the outcome. Now, the fact that things have been relatively okay, and I say relatively because there has been allegations of irregularities, I'm not dismissing it, but the fact that things have been relatively representative doesn't mean, the sun will rise tomorrow as well. So we might have a very different and difficult period between the two elections if Soner's prediction that there will be a runoff and effectively 14 days of voting, that brings its own complications in terms of instability, violence, intimidation, voter suppression in the countryside, and all of that. But I have to say, Turkey has switched to parliamentary monarchy in 1908. 1913 elections were marred with fraud in favor of the Young Turks. And then in 1946, a year after Turkey switched to parliamentary elections in 1946, again, people felt the counting was non-transparent. So we are looking at a track record of 2 big significant elections which have in the end turned out to be a punishment for the party that won because the voters and history has ended up punishing those. So it's not too bad. It gives you ground to be somewhat optimistic, But if you want to see glass half empty, it also gives you evidence to be somewhat pessimistic.
And if he should lose, does Erdogan leave office?
I think it depends on the margin. Clearly, the race has been unfair. Races in Turkey have been unfair for a long time now, for about half a decade. The vote itself will be free. I agree with Aslı. Turkey has a long tradition of democratic voting. In most cases, people's great-grandparents have been voting in free and fair elections. Turks have been voting in free and fair elections longer than the citizens of Spain have. So that's democratic resilience and memory. And I think that could bring in a wave that could humiliate and shock pollsters, just as you could have a wave that I call shy conservatives. Opposition candidate Kilicdaroglu is of the Alevi branch of Islam, a universalist understanding of the religion. I think there are some people in Turkey who probably not say in the polls that they will not vote for an Alevi candidate, but when they go to the ballot box, they'll change their mind. So we could be surprised both ways in terms of potential waves changing the outcome based on what the pollsters have been saying. But what remains a fact is that the vote is free and Turkey citizens love to vote. Turnout nears 90%. Turkey citizens love to go observe the tally. Your old grandmas and uncles and aunts will show up and observe the tally and take pictures. And so it's impossible in Turkey to rig the vote on a massive scale to change the outcome. But if the race is really contested and the race for presidency, either on May 14th or the 28th, is within 1% margin, or the race for the parliament on Sunday, May 14th, is within a few seats, I can easily see Erdogan challenging the outcome, pulling a January 6th and saying, oh, the vote is rigged. Of course, the vote is not rigged. What happens then is perhaps Erdogan should have a learning experience from the elections of 2019 in Istanbul. So part of me says he probably will not do it this time because in Istanbul 2019, when his candidate lost elections for mayor by a very narrow margin, 13,000 votes, insignificant in a city of 15 million people, Erdogan repeated the elections, and that experience should be a learning experience for him. What happened? Next, Erdogan thought because he controls all the institutions and media, he could repeat the elections in Istanbul, claim that the vote was rigged, and because the margin was so narrow, 13,000 votes, flip the outcome. The opposite happened. His candidate lost the repeat race by a margin of nearly 1 million votes. That is democratic resilience and memory. A lot of people who voted for him changed their vote. Others who abstained went to the ballot box. So I think in Turkey, elections are a source of legitimacy. Fair vote is a source of legitimacy. Citizens like to see those who lose step down, but stakes are so high for Erdogan. You know, he's been in power for 20 years, accumulated huge amount of power, stepped on many toes. There are corruption allegations against him and his family members. He fears that if he loses, he's not going to be given the option of what is typically offered to former Turkish presidents, most retire to the Aegean coast and take up fun hobbies like painting. I don't think that's what Erdogan thinks he has set up for him. So his worst fear is losing the election. And his game plan, I guess, is it depends on what the margin is. And it depends on if he believes he can change this margin, if it is narrow, relying on his institutional control and support in the media. I would think it will not succeed. I'm with Aslı on this. I think that having lived in a democratic society, Turkish citizens are resilient democratically. And I also think that a lesson of Iraq and Afghanistan for us was that globally, it takes a really, really long time to build a democracy. The lesson of Turkey under Erdogan is that it takes also a really long time to kill one. Turkey is still a democracy if one that is ruled by an autocrat. And I think the first part of that sentence matters a lot more on Sunday.
Different question for both of you. Let's assume a case in which the presidency goes to the opposition. Erdogan loses, but his party and its critical nationalist ally win a significant plurality, if not a majority, which could be possible based on polling, in the National Assembly. How does government work?
I think if he loses the election, as Soner said, depends on how big the margin is. If it's a humiliating defeat, President Erdogan would decide to retire. But if it is significant majority, if not a significant presence in the Turkish parliament, he will be plotting his return. He would be the leader of the AKP camp, his ruling Justice and Party camp in the opposition in parliament, and plotting his return in much the same way, in a sense, Benjamin Netanyahu has done when he was voted out with a coalition of 6, externally supported by Palestinians in a similar situation. He stayed as an opposition figure, very relevant for the Israeli debate, forcing early elections eventually and criticizing the performance of the government. I think if he has a reasonable enough of a presence in parliament, he would take the Netanyahu route. If it's a humiliating defeat for him, that would be a different ballgame in the sense that the party would dissolve, I think.
So you, Aslı, tie the future of the op to the ability to not just achieve a plurality, if not majority in the parliament, but the magnitude, should it be this way, of the defeat of Erdogan for the presidency.
I don't think there is AK party beyond President Erdogan. If he's not there, I think the party would dissolve or effectively break up. Much like Motherland Party of Turgut Özal, his presence was an important guiding principle, and Erdogan is, of course, a micromanager and a very strong leader, but the party was never institutional enough. Now, Erdogan has his problem is that he's too strong a leader, not allowing for the party to institutionalize. Yes, there are structures and committees and everything, but all decisions rest on one person. And increasingly, it's become, for lack of a better word, a bit of a personality cult. You know, their song about the elections is still a song about Erdogan. So I think it's very hard for the party to outlast him if there is no Erdogan as a political factor.
So, Soner, I'll ask you a complex what happens next question. If Erdogan loses the presidency by a meaningful margin and not challengeable margin, but it's not a humiliating defeat, it's 3 or 4 percentage points, for example. And if the AK has the plurality in the parliament, can an opposition president actually take a policy course on the 2 issues which most, I think, shape this election and will shape the future of Turkey for Turks, which is fiscal and monetary policy? And can they shape government external policies vis-a-vis NATO, vis-a-vis their neighbors, notably Greece? Or will they be constrained by the presence of a still existing AK, and, if Aslı, you're correct, and Erdogan determined to do what he can to bring about the downfall of the government?
I would take your question in 2 parts, David. So the question is, what does Erdogan do immediately after May 14th, where Turkey's citizens will cast 2 ballots simultaneously, one for prime minister, one for president? And the outcome is that although Erdogan's bloc has a plurality of votes in the legislature, he's trailing opposition Kilicdaroglu from behind. So one of the hallmarks of authoritarian populists is that they'll violate democratic norms, but they'll claim that their opponents do those things. So in recent days, there was an attack on Istanbul mayor and opposition vice president candidate İmamoğlu in the northeastern Turkish city of Erzurum. His bus and people attending his rally were pelted with stones. Interior Minister Soylu, who reports to Erdogan, suggested that İmamoğlu had arranged this attack on himself. So, blame the victim. If Erdogan comes up, plurality of seats in the parliament, but trails Kilicdaroglu from behind, trust me, I think what he's going to say is the following. I'm the underdog. The whole world has supported Kilicdaroglu, in quotes, London bankers, the West, and yet he still has not been able to defeat me. Look, I have plurality of seats in the parliament. Vote for me. That may or may not help him to consolidate enough support to get over 50% on May 28th. But assuming Kilicdaroglu still wins the presidency, and we have what Turkey's constitutional drafters never envisioned, split government. This constitution was written in such a hasty manner that it wasn't given enough thought of, what happens if legislative and executive branches are in different hands? It's written with an eye to as if the same political party would control both branches of government. So if we have split government, I think that is sort of a recipe for political crisis. Although, sadly for Erdogan, he has loaded the presidency up with so much power that Kilicdaroglu should be the effective decision-making in the country with his cabinet, constituted by his table of 6 alliance members representing other parties. Erdogan has loyalists in the bureaucracy. And while the parliament cannot really slow down the president's acts, some of the decrees that the president issues can be returned by the parliament if they're national security, but not all. I think that on economic policy, it's conceivable to see Kilicdaroglu execute his policy. But on foreign policy issues, because of this clause that national security decrees can be returned, not blocked, but returned back to the president, will probably delay some of the steps that the Kilicdaroglu presidency wants to take. But that is if Turkey were not a polarized country. Turkey has been deeply polarized, and tradition of working across the aisle together has disappeared, sadly and unfortunately, among the elites. So I think Erdogan's game plan in the run-up to May 14th is Orban's playbook. Attack the opposition, alleging that it's supported by the outsiders, claim to be the only native son of this country, and ask the population to support you. That worked for Orban because the economy in Hungary was doing well. It may not work for Erdogan because the economy in Turkey is not doing well. And it doesn't matter how much it shifts the narrative. I think people are aware that it's not going well. But assuming that we end with a split government where Erdogan has plurality of seats in the parliament, maybe near majority, and then Kilicdaroglu is in the presidential seat, I agree with Aslı. I think Erdogan's game plan this time is Netanyahu playbook, right? Opposition in Turkey looks similar to the opposition that voted Netanyahu out in Israel. It's the ideological rainbow. You have everything in it, from political Islamists to socialists and everything in between. I think that the reason the opposition is united is to defeat Erdogan. They'll probably stay united for at least a year. You have a nationwide local elections coming up next spring. Opposition knows that they cannot win the elections for big cities, an important race, if they are not united. But after that, perhaps you could see the opposition presidency and government splintering. But, given what Turkey went through, I think even 1 year of change and back to democracy and back to transatlantic community and economic orthodoxy is not a bad thing for Turkey. So I'll take that over the alternative, of course.
Okay, so we have a split government, let's presume. Opposition controls the presidency. Parliament is significantly dominated by AKP, or at least has a significant AKP presence. What does the new government of Turkey do with respect to those issues outside Turkey that matter so much to us? Swedish membership in NATO, resolution of the long-standing S-400 issue, the relationship between Turkey and Greece, the relationship between Turkey and Russia. What do you think happens next on those?
Well, first order of business for the post-Erdogan government would be, of course, stabilizing the markets, because Turkish economy is broken and its state coffers are empty. And President Erdogan has created a mess of rules and regulations and new rules and regulations that make it very hard for an immediate return to a more predictable rules-based economic model. So economy will be a challenge. And of course, on the domestic scene, they'll want democratization and reform. But when it comes to foreign policy, I think there is an understanding here that taking steps on the home front in terms of Turkey's return to rule of law would automatically create the kind of conditions and climate you need for Turkey to improve its relations with its transatlantic allies, former allies, and European Union and the United States. I mean, that proposition is partly true, but of course you need to go into the details of it. Yes, there will be good reception and recognition of an opposition government, and congratulations, and sort of everyone will toast Turkey's return to democracy. But at the end of the day, now the set of problems between Turkey and the United States have become so complicated that we have to go one by one. I think S-400 issue is difficult to solve. I cannot see the next government shipping S-400 bags, but maybe what they will want is a conversation with the US about how their presence in Turkey in a non-operational manner could be made acceptable to US Congress in one fashion or another. If there are ways that could work without Turkey sending it abroad, at least that will be their first attempt. I think that Sweden issue is somewhat easier because they've said they will ratify Sweden's NATO accession. There's a timing issue in terms of the parliamentary calendar, but it may not be in time for the Vilnius summit. But what might happen is a strong declaration that Turkey will do this when the parliament opens. And this, of course, might be helped by the fact that Sweden is going to pass an anti-terrorism legislation that may help the government's hand. But, Greece is also an area that I'm not too worried, because traditionally Social Democrats in Turkey have advocated Turkish-Greek friendship going back to 70s and focusing on cultural similarities, concerts and visits and so on and so forth. It won't be that difficult for a post-Erdogan government, particularly one led by CHP, where Ekrem İmamoğlu plays a prominent role, to establish cultural bridges and a political dialogue with Greece. I don't think any of Turkey's positions or Greece's positions would change when it comes to the legal issues that have to do with the Aegean disputes, but a better climate makes a big difference. Even if countries continue to hold on to their legal position, a better climate, better atmosphere, good relations can actually really change things. I think where I see a problem is Europe. Europeans seem very unprepared for an opposition victory, in the sense that I don't think they are willing to roll out long-term strategic plan for Turkey. And an opposition victory will be great, come and visit. But what about the future of Turkish-European relationship? What about perhaps resuscitating the parts of the accession process, even knowing that Turkey will never be a member of the EU, but perhaps the process itself can be useful? What about customs union, to expanding Turkey's free trade agreement with Europe, particularly at a time when there's a good deal of focus on both sides of the Atlantic to diversify supply lines away from China? So I don't think Europeans have thought through these issues. And my sense is you might need a bit more the US administration leaning in on the strategic forecast on some of these issues. But on Russia, maybe I should leave that to Soner. I think it's very hard to walk away from the balancing act with Russia, but it's a juicy topic. So,
And Soner, final comment to you on Russia.
Right.
And should we anticipate any meaningful change at all in terms of the government's approach, should the opposition win the presidency, to northern Syria, by which I mean Idlib and the status quo there, the SDF YPG and the government's security position towards that challenge, and the Kurdish PKK issue in general? Anything that we can see from the new government in the way?
I would say dividing foreign policy issues, looking at them, I think I'm tempted to divide them into what I call ossified issues: Turkish-Greek disputes, Cyprus, East Med, and Aegean disputes, and Turkish views of PKK and YPG. Those will not change under a Kilicdaroglu presidency. What will change, however, is the tone of the relationship will change with Greece. There will be no Kilicdaroglu threatening to throw missiles in Athens, though no such missiles exist. But it's enough, I think, to get many people worried and alarmed. And institutionalization of foreign policy, meaning the driver's seat is going to be occupied by foreign ministry bureaucrats and diplomats, will take the pressure off and the tensions of Greek-Turkish ties. I think in Syria, while Turkish views of the PKK and YPG won't change significantly, support for the Brotherhood will come to an end as if cut with a knife. Now, President Erdogan, who supported the Brotherhood in the region and Hamas regionally for about 10 years, has recently had gone quiet on this because he's trying to reset ties with wealthy Gulf monarchies to trigger investment flows that has succeeded. But if the economy is bouncing back, I can easily see President Erdogan going back to a pro-Brotherhood policy in the Middle East. That's not Kilicdaroglu's policy at all. I always thought that Erdogan's AKP is Brotherhood light, and therefore the affinities for the Brotherhood regionally. I thought that the ideological component of the foreign policy of Turkey towards Middle East will disappear. That's a big change that will, of course, allow for a relationship with Israel, Gulf monarchies, and GCC members to flourish. I think Assad regime actually has been intentionally delaying a handshake with Erdogan. I think Assad does not want to give the gift of a refugee settlement to Erdogan A handshake between Assad and Erdogan would include a commitment for the refugees eventually to go back. Now, we all know that they're not going to go back, but can you sell the narrative that this issue is resolved to the Turkish public? A handshake between Erdogan and Assad would have given Erdogan that reward, and I think Assad has decided not to provide that to Erdogan. So I think Turkish-Syrian normalization will move faster if Kılıçdaroğlu wins, and that also means the end of the war. Russia is difficult. I agree with Aslı. I think that one of the first acts of a Kılıçdaroğlu presidency is going to be restoring rule of law domestically, releasing unjustly fair politicians such as HDP leader Demirtas and philanthropist Osman Kavala, restoring institutional autonomy from foreign ministry to courts to central bank. And earlier I said the state of the economy in Turkey is President Erdogan's doing, and I said these unorthodox policies. But I'd like to add to it the fact that if your central bank is not autonomous, investors are going to trust you. And return of central bank autonomy is going to be good for the investment environment. I think that we're going to see large amounts of foreign direct investment flow into the country again. That's going to be good for the economy. It will stabilize the coalition government, probably delay the infighting that we would like to see if there's also an economic crisis happening, and enter Russia. So Putin is not going to be happy about the Kılıçdaroğlu presidency because it means Turkey aligning with the transatlantic community once again. I can see Ankara putting a signature on their joint declaration signed by transatlantic community, whether it is criticizing Russia's aggression against Ukraine or the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs. Under Erdogan, of course, Turkish government, although it supports Ukraine militarily, has not criticized Russia politically and also kept ties with Russia open economically. That's not going to be very favorable to Putin, but I think Russia know that also when they confront the Turks align completely with the West. So I think Putin will resort to informal weapons, perhaps sanctions, tourism sanctions, telling Russians to not visit Turkey for security reasons. He's done it before. Commercial sanctions targeting food products, saying they're not sanitary. He's done it before. In both of these cases, these were lies, but these could hurt Turkey's economic recovery. I think that the EU has a role to play. So does the US in stabilizing Turkey.
I thank you both for your commentary. A fascinating May 14th ahead of us and possibly a time afterwards. I look forward to talking with you both again after those events. Aslı, Soner, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for hosting
Great
us.
conversation.
The Baker Institute for Public Policy provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization based at Rice University in Houston, Texas. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording on the campus of Rice, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. Thank you for listening.